So just my talk, I think the broader title perhaps would be something like the spiritual and intellectual meaning of fasting, especially in reference to Maulana Thanwi and in the context of the modern period. Though in his texts on fasting, Maulana Thanwi does not reference, in at least in his major works, that we are living in the modern period. All of his works are written in such a way and with the context of the modern situation of Muslims in mind. And this is what actually makes him somewhat unique among the major ulama, is his awareness of the changes brought about by modernity. In fact, there is one book that I won't be looking at in which he has looked specifically at different facets of Islamic life and how that has been transformed or changed or affected by modernity. It's called Islahi in Qadab Ummat, which has several chapters on fasting and but that deals more with problems he sees in the modern subcontinent Muslim world due to in the practice of fasting. So I won't focus on that. I'll be focusing one more kind of inspired by his example to look at the kind of role fasting can play in our increasingly, at least particularly in the West, but it's really global, and Pakistan has changed in this way a lot as well. Increasingly consumerist culture of kind of our contemporary era, and then looking at starting with that, and then I'll look at particularly at one specific text of Maulana Thanwi, al-Masail al-Aqliya lil-Ahkam al-Naqliya, which deals with the intellectual foundations or rationales behind the ahkam of Islam, behind different practices, rituals, really all that is found in the Sharia. So his treatment of fasting and its significance and its universality is very important in and that's something we'll talk about. Or not important. Is quite comprehensive in looking at the different rationales behind why Muslims fast or why fasting is ordained in Islam. All right. So if we look at our present way of life, consumption is increasingly, it's something that becomes a increasingly part of the culture. And as I mentioned, I live in the United States for many years, but even in Pakistan, some of you, I mean, I don't know your ages and so forth, but in Pakistan, when I didn't come to Pakistan for many years. So I lived at 2005 to 2007 in Islamabad, went to the US, didn't come back until 2016. So something like 8 years. It was it says it was coming to a new place, in Islamabad. And Lahore, I'm sure is similar. In how much products, kind of capitalist consumerist culture had penetrated. There were malls everywhere. There were people buying everything is sold according to brands, things that you didn't have even in Pakistan maybe 10, 12 years ago. So there's so this applies, of course, the whole technological revolution. So I remember in 2016, even the Jamadar that was cleaning the street outside my house. I remember, the bell would ring and he'd take it out and start again something you wouldn't have 15 years ago or something. You wouldn't think about that. So so it's becoming a kind of global reality. So when I was on a personal note, when I was an undergraduate, when I came from Pakistan to the United States to study, and before I went into the study of religion, I was a business major for a while. Before realizing, that this is not what I wanted to do with my life, and part of what led me away from business, apologies if you're business people out there, but what led me away from business was a statement in the introduction of my macroeconomics book, which defined human beings as essentially consumers. I think the definition ran something like humans are beings with unlimited wants. It was a very kind of definition of human being, and I'll come back to that of how we define ourselves really affects how we think about ourselves, both as society as an individual, as individuals. Sorry. So this view of human nature, in which we're looked at basically as consumers, caters to nothing more than our immediate wants and desires, and offers no other way to human fulfillment than the amassing of commodities. For isn't it logical that if our main function here on earth is to consume, then our way of life should be built upon acquiring more and more? Such is surely the premise of the current way of life, at least and from a capitalist perspective, in which we essentially try to buy our happiness. But this way of life also comes with a very heavy price, about which we can talk all day, but just to mention two things: the pillaging and destruction of the environment to satisfy our own often manufactured wants, and the splintering of community as we spend more and more time with our individual possessions. Really thinking about social media and so forth, iPhone, Facebook, Netflix accounts, give examples in which we're engaging mostly with ourselves or our personalized world that we've created online. So we can get so lost in our gadgets and the image of ourselves that they construct that we forget who we really are. So are human beings merely consumers, or is there something more to them? Of course, the answer of all the great religions of the world is a unanimous no to the first question, that are we consumers, or that's what we're supposed to do, and a resounding yes to the second, that there's much more to life. So in the Abrahamic religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, human beings are made in God's image, and alone among God's vast creations possess free will and the fullness of intelligence. This latter aspect particularly brought out by Islam. So in Islam, the fault of Adam and Eve disobeying God resulted not in original sin, but a state of forgetfulness. So our present lifestyle of consumption is, from this perspective, a complete forgetfulness of the possibilities of the human state, of who God made us to be. So what is the antidote? And of course there can be quite a few according to different religious perspectives and within different religions. And speaking about Islam, one thing or one practice in Islam that is really at the very antithesis of this, and we'll look at this more carefully in a minute, is the practice of fasting. And fasting, of course, is a universal reality in the sense that multiple religious traditions practice fasting. Fasting is really found in the Abrahamic religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, but well beyond it. There's fast days in Hinduism, many of them, and different kinds of Hinduism. There is fasting in the Buddhist tradition, in the native traditions. The main practice, for example, in the Native Americans, where I live in Minnesota, this used to be kind of one of the strong areas of the Plains Indians, the Plains Native Americans of the Plains, and their main ritual of the sun dance requires 4 days of of fasting without any food and water. So a little harder, ज़्यादा मुश्किल है, for 4 days. But Islam particularly has a kind of practice of fasting in which you don't have, which is perhaps the most, when compared to other religious traditions, perhaps the only one that requires the whole community instead of particular specific individuals or particular 1 or 2 days here or there. Or, for example, in Christianity, the fasting in Lent, in which you give up particular things, but not, it's more of an exchange than a giving up. So, you, for example, don't eat meat, but instead you eat vegetables or something. Many Christians don't practice this anymore anyways. Or they say, okay, I'll just give up chocolate for 40 days or something. It's become very watered down. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, it is more seriously practiced, or in other forms of Oriental Christianity, but not so much in the Western churches. So in Islam, this is a practice for the whole community. So the kind of effect it can have on a communal level, and it does, is immense as compared to other religious traditions, and not discounting anything. Of course, these are all extremely significant practices and important practices in the life of any religious community. But particular religions have more of an emphasis than others on it, but they all serve the same purpose, as we'll see. And when Maulana Thanawi, for example, talks about it, fasting, he's not only talking from a perspective which only applies to Muslims, but to human beings in general, as we'll see. So come back to what I was talking about. Yeah. So how is fasting an antidote to the consumerist, consumptive lifestyle? It is an antidote because it's a call to something that is the opposite of this, which is renunciation, sacrifice. And it tells us to give up, even though it's temporarily, not only our immediate wants, but even our immediate needs. And this is an important distinction. It's it's sometimes it's easy to give up our wants, but our needs, zaruriyat, is much more difficult. And if you can do a little bit of the second, it's easier to do. It's easier to do the first. So by denying our most immediate needs as well as our most immediate desires, that of eating and drinking, fasting can put its practitioners in an alternative state of mind, a different state of consciousness, where one can cultivate the spiritual parts of ourselves that we often neglect in favor of our physical body. I mean, if you even think about how much energy we spend from day to day towards responding to our physical needs, that we want this, we want to be in this place, we want to eat this, we want to enjoy that. That human life is constantly dominated, one could say, by our, many times not even very consciously, chasing our desires, chasing our wants. and not just our needs. So from that perspective, which, for example, since I'm doing a little bit of comparative here, the Buddhist tradition is particularly very interesting about, there's places where it intersects with the Islamic and particularly Sufi understanding of the self, or of the problem of the ego or the nafs, right? In the Buddhist tradition, we have the idea that all evil, all ignorance, all suffering comes from desire. That human beings are constantly motivated by desire, and desire. There's two things that can happen. With chaha to do cheezein possible hai. Either you'll get it or you won't, right? So either you get what you desire, or you don't get what you desire. In the Buddhist tradition, in both ways, you lose. The reason being is, if you don't get what you desire, that's easy to understand. Yes, so it causes suffering, it causes pain. You're chasing after something, you want something, you don't have it. How is it a problem, or how do you lose if you get it? Because you don't really get it, right? You cannot possess. Everything is fani, it's impermanent, right? So it's so whatever you have, now you have developed a fear. Now I have it. What if I lose it? What if I don't have it anymore? How will I? What will I do then? So this could be on a very small level, which doesn't affect you in a deep emotional way, or it could be as far as individual other people in one's life or something are concerned. This could be affecting you in a very, very deep level. So, but coming back to my point is that desire, therefore, is a central motivation of human beings, in which we preoccupy ourselves for much of the time. And so we're preoccupied with kind of our physical needs, our maybe mental, emotional wants, and less so, much less so, I would say, with our spiritual needs, right? That there's not even a time necessarily, or a way to, on everyday level. I mean, if you go and pray, of course, as Muslims, we pray, we do various other practices, and that does help. But a sustained way to continuously break the hold of desire on us, and in Islamic terms, you would say of the nafs on us, as we'll see with Maulana Thanawi in a minute. We need something more, and fasting acts as that, because it breaks our what the Sufi tradition sometimes called tark al-adat, that the breaking of habits, that it makes us, it takes us away from our normal cycle of doing what we want, and by focusing, by helping us to deny even our basic needs, it trains us to be less attached to our wants, and less kind of chasing after what we desire. So it helps spiritually reform ourselves. And, some of this I'm saying as a kind of being inspired by Maulana Thanawi, but I'll before we get to the text. So let's let me. Right. So one of the so now let me turn to the views of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanawi. The meaning of fasting in Islam has been widely discussed by many scholars, the ulama, Sufiya, by the hukama, and one could talk a lot about the whole tradition, which we don't have time for. So I will only look at some views, as I mentioned, of Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanawi. Many of you might be familiar with who he is. He's one of the luminaries of the Islamic intellectual tradition in the modern period in South Asia. His age, or rather his time period in which he lived, goes from 1863 to 1943, for reference. He was a prolific scholar, wrote literally hundreds of works. Some of them are very small, but some are voluminous, and on a great variety of subjects, on really all the disciplines of the major disciplines in Islamic studies. And from Quranic commentaries to hadith works to collections of fatawa, but his most sustained work was in spirituality, in tasawwuf particularly, and in ruhaniyat and its many facets. And as I already mentioned, one of the most interesting things about his approach was that he was quite conscious of the conditions of modernity, that Muslim society under colonialism had been completely either destroyed or transformed, and was in a process of upheaval, where sources of authority, ways of understanding were both deeply challenged, or traditional Islamic authorities and traditional Islamic ways of understanding the world and our place in it were deeply under attack. And he wrote both for intellectuals and for the common person, oftentimes more for the latter. This is also an age when print became much more accessible, and so more and more people were reading. Books were available, printed, and so forth, which was not the case, even 150 years ago. Around that time, it started. So he wrote on a variety of subjects, but particularly with a view to guiding Muslims towards a deeper understanding of the various aspects of Islam, from Islamic theology to Islamic law to the Quran to particularly the spiritual tradition. And he oftentimes his work synthesized all these dimensions. He was not only speaking on as a specialist in one thing or another thing. So one thing that he, again, because of the conditions of modernity, he understood the centrality of rationalism, and of how modern Muslims had become extremely drawn to looking for rational reasons, and oftentimes they were used to attack religion, as they had been in the West. So this was British colonial period. The attack on rationality, attack on religion rather, comes from rational sources, and in some ways that nothing has changed. I mean, we have other postmodern ways of attacking religion today as well, but the rationalist approach is still very much there. And so Maulana Thanawi, and interestingly in this he was foreshadowed briefly, not in any sense as comprehensively as Maulana Thanawi attempted it, but by another alim, Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, who's a Bani of the School of Deoband, who was the first to kind of try to look at religious precepts in a rational way, in order to respond to, or this kind of newfound, what one could say, doubts due to a rational, due to trying to find the rationality of religion, and using reason as a way of saying, oh, this is not rational. Akal ko अकल नहीं मानती इसलिए ये गलत है. So Maulana Thanwi tries to, in one very remarkable, very interesting work that I just mentioned, al-Masali al-Aqliya, lil-Ahkam al-Naqliya, which means that the intellectual kind of intellectual principles or intellectual or rational explanations of, I'm paraphrasing it, I'm not exact translating, of the Naqli. The Naqli sciences are, or Naqli commands are, the Aqal and the Naqal. Aqal is the intellect, Naqal is that which is transmitted. So in Islamic tradition, and some of you might be familiar with this anyways, but for those of you who are not, the Aqli and the Naqli are the two branches of the Islamic tradition. So or Islamic sciences or disciplines that are taught. So in the old days, if you were go to a madrasa, they would teach you Aqli and Naqli sciences, and so it's still done, although the Aqli sciences have really been declined and kind of overtaken by modern university, but of course not from a Muslim perspective or Islamic perspective. So in this text, what he tries to do is that he tries to talk about the ahkam in a aqli way, to find the rational reasons of why Islam ordains the things that it does, or why in the Sharia, why the Quran and the Hadith and the Islamic law that emerged from them, along with other sources, why do Muslims do the things that they do? One could say it that way. And he goes through really every kind of, it's a very interesting text, because he goes even small things. He talks at length about, why do, on this chapter in fasting, I mean, I won't talk about these things, but, he has a whole huge section on why there are 30 days, or, why, why is it from sunrise to sunset, and things like that. But in other places, he goes, well, why do we do wudu, and why qurbani, and all sorts of things. So, for the rest of my time, I'll just look at this text briefly with you. One just starting section of the chapter on fasting. So, basic question he asks in this text is, इंसान के लिए रोजा मुकर्रर होने की वजह कि हमें इंसान के लिए रोजे की क्या जरूरत है. And his answer to that is a universal kind of answer. He doesn't talk about only this is only for Muslims, but that is part of the fitrah. That our fitri fitri taqaze is that we are that the aql should be in control of the nafs. Aql ko nafs par qalba hona chahiye. Wa tasallut daimi, matlab har waqt consistently आपकी अकल आपकी नफ्स को डोमिनेट कर सके, उस पे उसकी कंट्रोल कर सके. तो this is the kind of fitri state. But he states, as we all know, and what we've been talking about, that this is not the way that human beings are. That we're far away from our fitri reality, and we are misled, or one could say due to human weakness, right, in all sorts of ways. And the nafs often has power over our aql, right? And therefore, the way for disciplining and purifying the nafs. He says, लिहाजा तहजीब और तज़किया नफ्स के लिए इस्लाम ने रोजे को असूल में से ठहराया. Because the very basis of the fast is to break this hold that the nafs has on us. So, of course, Maulana Thanawi is talking here about our essential reality, which is that we are made in, as one hadith says, خَلَقَ اللَّهُ آدَمَ عَلَى سُرَتِهِ, that Allah Ta'ala made Adam in his own image, right? And then one way of reading that is that this image is imprinted on our fitrah, that our true nature with God is that we reflect the highest of qualities that God has given us, which are His own qualities, right? In our best state, in our highest possibility, if we were living according to the fitrah, that would be a state of human perfection. And one could say that the prophets and the awliya were, aspired to that state. But unfortunately, we are not in harmony with our fitrah, but rather we are in a state of ghaflat. And ghaflat is a very nice word. Urdu mein ghaflat ka maane mein aa jata hai just behoshi, bhool jana, ghalti, laparwahi. But it's a great word. But it shows a lot about different aspects of what the problem is with human beings from a theological perspective. That we are both in a state of forgetfulness, but also in a state of laparwahi, like heedlessness, and wrongdoing, and which disconnects us both from God and from our own true self. And the world distracts us, and the nafs helps with that. And religion, in that sense, is a way to just reconnect ourselves to the fitrah. And fasting is one of the most powerful ways, for it breaks the hold that dunya has over us and redirects our energy, our taqat, himmat, towards God. And one could say towards our true self, towards kind of regaining that fitri state. And we were talking before how much we pay attention to our physical needs, and it also helps us rebalance by focusing on our spiritual needs, right, from our Ruhani needs. So Maulana Thanawi here says that one of the basic things that Roza does is that it establishes complete control of the nafs, of the aql over the nafs. And why is this important? Partially, I mean, I could give commentary on all of his different precepts, but I'll go a little bit because I think the time is going faster than I thought. So why is this important? Because it is through the aql dominating the nafs that we're able to fulfill every responsibility upon us. This is something that can, for Maulana Thanawi, as for others in the Islamic intellectual tradition, is the basic principle of how we should live our lives, is that there are haqooq that we need to fulfill, and this is what we should be doing from a day to. This is how we should envisage our lives. That there's haqooq to God, of God that need to be fulfilled, haqooq of other human beings, and haqooq of our own nafs. And all of these haqooq cannot be fulfilled if our nafs is ghalib over our aql. And in this sense, relating to modernity, we think about individualism, and we, from an individualist kind of perspective, freedom from we think that giving freedom to the nafs is freedom, right? But in fact, real freedom is freedom from the self. That we can talk, of course, more about that. But true freedom is not being able to do whatever you want. It's really of breaking that hold of the nafs that takes you to, as you know, we're doing a comparative thing with the Buddhist tradition, a place where that it'll cause suffering and ignorance and evil at the end of the day. So let's turn to a second thing he mentions, and his various points, is that fasting produces रोजे से खशियत और तक़वे की सिफ़त इंसान में पैदा हो जाती है। चुनाचे खुदा ताला कुरान शरीफ में फरमाते हैं लअल्लकुम तत्तक़ून, जिसका तर्जुमा है यानी रोजा तुम पर इसलिए मुकर्रर हुआ कि तुम मुत्तकी हो जाओ। तो, and this is self-explanatory, but let me combine it with the next one, in which he says, रोजा रखने से इंसान को अपनी आजिज़ी और मस्कीनियत और खुदा ताला के जलाल और उसकी कुदरत पर नजर पड़ती है. So both of these talk about how fasting helps us realize a kind of the fareeb, kind of illusion that we've created, that we are in charge, that we are in control, and it reveals our utter dependence, that we can be so, so taken out of sorts and feel so weak just because of a couple of physical needs are denied, and that ultimately the only one who has qadar and is God. That it brings us to a kind of a true realization of our state as human beings, and our dependency as human beings. The fourth point he makes, he said more about this, he says in other words, but this is a nice one. Roze se chashme basirat khulti hai. So, chashme basirat, so the spiritual insight, the eye of spiritual insight, one could say, is open through fasting. And of course, fasting combined with prayer and reflection puts us, as I mentioned before, in an alternative state of consciousness, in which our normal perception of reality is altered. It gives us the possibility of accessing aspects of ourselves that we are usually not in touch with. Our heart, our spirit, deeper layers of our, more spiritual layers of ourself. Fifth point, and I'm going quickly over these now. He talks about how Durandeshi, which kind of means intelligence or wisdom, can grow through fasting, because it helps us properly, puts our akal in charge, and so we can actually gain in our intelligence and mature in it. Number 6, he says, is kashf haqaiq al-ashya hota hai, so that the true realities of things are unveiled, right? And again, we could talk a long time about this, but very simply, we are able to see how things are fani. Sari dunya fani hai, sab hum fani hai. Everything is is changeable, and it's the things that we take so seriously, again exposed on our basic kind of needs, food, drink, other physical needs, that we can still survive without them. I mean, not ultimately, but there are it destabilizes our kind of comfort with the things of the world. It puts us in a different state of consciousness where we're able to have an insight into the reality of things. So another way of reading this would also be that we realize our real state, so related to the last, to the precept number 4, that our own, maybe that was number 3, our dependency. But of course, it can also relate to how we are can appreciate things, right? when we don't have them. And he gets to that point at one of the later precepts here. So number 7, he says, darandagi se duri hoti hai. So and that's another Urdu ka acha lafz hai, darinda. Darinda kya hota hai? Jo ki cheer phaad ke khaye cheezon ko. So this kind of vicious, very vicious. So this viciousness that we unfortunately carry within us, it cuts us off from that, right? And curbs our animal nature, the animal self, and also the kind of traits such as anger, which we're supposed to calm down during fasting, or even our kind of sexual and jinsi needs. Number 8, we say it's something again we don't think about so much in the modern world. I think as devout Muslims, I probably used to think more of this, way more than we do now. And he says, "Malaika ilahi se qurb hasil hota hai." So, and this is something that was much more a part of a pre-modern understanding of the universe, in which the universe is multi-layered. It's not this horizontal plane, and even if you take the Quranic example of alim al-ghayb, alim al-shahada, the seen world and the unseen world, that both of these were always with us. They were always present. There were things we can't see and things that we could see, and sometimes the unseen became more open to our. Maybe if we couldn't see it, we could perceive it through basirat or in other spiritual and subtle ways. And the reality of the angels is among those realities. The fact that there's angels, they're everywhere. That all sorts of things that happen, that angels are a kind of an intrinsic part of the way that Muslims are supposed to imagine the universe and understand the universe. So it opens up those doors, according to Maulana Thanwi. Next, he talks about number 9 is Khuda Taala ki shukr guzari ka mauka milta hai. So that's again, it's a self-explanatory, but by denying ourselves that which we have taken for granted, we remember the great blessings that God gives us through food and drink, and by extension, everything else, right? That we are able to be thankful when things are denied. And that's, again, it's the unfortunate state of human beings, but this is how we are. So just a couple of more things here. So another thing he talks about is insani hamdardi ka dil mein ubhar paida hota hai. And he discusses this at length, that compassion towards others arises in the heart. So he's been talking mostly of the individual spiritual aspects of fasting, but now here he extends it to a human and social level, and how that itself is connected to spirituality. Because he emphasizes that fasting enables us to empathize with others who do not have what we may have, and he who has not experienced hunger and thirst cannot be acquainted with the hal of the hungry and the thirsty, right? And therefore, he cannot also be truly thankful to God until he feels the hunger and thirst and weakness in his body. As Rumi's poetry, if you're familiar with that, shows that things are often known through their opposites. Things are known through their opposites. This is a larger idea in Islamic thought as well. Mawlana Thanawi, of course, was a great. He wrote a whole multi-volume, I think 16 volumes or something, commentary on the Masnavi. So that's another side of his work. But he adds particularly that when some beloved thing, for example, is lost, that's when one realizes its worth, through the firaq, through the separation from it. Again, a very important principle, that you know things through not having them. Let me just summarize his last couple of points. So one, that another thing he talks about is necessary, that fasting is necessary for the health of the body and the spirit. So the qillat, the paucity of food and drinks, is regarded by doctors as beneficial for the body, but by the Sufiya as beneficial for cleansing the heart, right? And in another work, Hayat al-Muslimin, he talks about how every person, he quotes a hadith that how zakah purifies one's wealth, and in the same way, fasting purifies one both spiritually and physically. So it's that the zakah of the body. So, and again, more could be said about that. In that sense, fasting integrates all aspects of the human being: the mind, the body, the spirit. Very much in line with. One could even argue that there's kind of a Muhammadi way of fasting, but I unfortunately we don't have time to go into that right now. Last 2 points he mentions in this is that fasting is a kind of spiritual food for human beings, and it will become a kind of food in the next world. So he who has fasted will carry that food with them in the other world, and who has not will be deprived of that. And you could see that deprivation, that they would not have that kind of spiritual nourishment. That what is physical nourishment here, and a denial of physical nourishment will turn into spiritual nourishment in the afterlife. And the things that we didn't get here, we would get in a better form there. And finally, his last point is that fasting is a sign of the love of God, right? That he gives this example, just say, just as one who loves someone gives up food and drink in a state of inebriation, you're like completely lost. You forget about all your needs because you're so deeply madly in love. And you might even forget, to eat and drink. So he says, very beautifully that fasting should be that, and maybe not everybody is quite there, but that's what it's like. That is for the believer. It should be a way of love of God. They forget everything for the sake of God. And in another work, Hayat al-Muslimin, that I mentioned before, he says that even if you're not at that state, it's a way of developing that state. That by practicing something with a particular reality, by doing it over and over, you would develop that kind of love. Okay, I think I'll stop there. I think and see if there are. I'll turn it over to.
Gee, that was fascinating and very enriching. MashaAllah, wonderful presentation. We have one question which you might have answered, but maybe you could. It's by one of our students, Dr. Hussain Kazmi from Boston. He's saying, what does Maulana Thanwi have to say about achieving the spiritual aspect of fasting beyond the ritual of remaining hungry or abstinence during the period of fasting alone?
So, Maulana, I'm particularly looking at a work of his in which he's going into uh, the different aspects of the very kind of the basic act of fasting, of denying food and because that is always there. There's no spiritual dimension of fasting in which those things are not involved. I mean, that's what Maulana Thanawi would say, it leads you to the spiritual state and to different levels of. So you might begin with feeling just hungry or but as he mentioned, it opens up into all sorts of spiritual realities, the opening of one's spiritual insight, the becoming detached from the world, the developing of a connection with the spiritual world, for example, the world of the angels, and a cleansing of the heart so that one can reconnect with God. So I think though he's beginning with the ahkam in a certain sense, but he's even in this work where he's not connected with purely kind of the spiritual, or he's not taking it purely from only a Sufi perspective. He's still deeply, I think, going into fasting. But in other works, which I don't have time to look into, he does, much of his writing is about the Sufi tradition. So it's something I can't just tell you without a reference, but he has written more specifically about for example, people on the spiritual path who and what role fasting can play in that.
It seems, I mean, exactly what you're saying. It seems that that is presupposed for a pious sort of a Muslim. I mean, that some degree of practice is presupposed for it to have this fruit, which the Maulana is referring to. Na? Okay, for
Yes.
him, that is a given. For us, sort of secularized Muslims, it is doubly difficult to get in that state because we are so sort of just attached to the outward, even in the religious sphere.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes. And yeah, that actually on some level, even the outward immediately that gives access as much as your capacity to the inward, because you can't go to the inward without stepping through the outward. I remember I think Sayyid Hussain Nasrin, one of my teachers, he mentioned that modern writers sometimes talk about how Hafiz Shirazi says throw away the janamaz and he's saying it in the Sufi way that you have to go deeper than the just formality of things. But they're like, oh, this means we don't need to practice the Sharia or don't need to focus on the outward. So he said, you need to own a janamaz in order to throw it away. So the idea is that you are you know a thing, you practice it, only then can you transcend it. So you begin with the basic practice of fasting, uh, and you grow to your capacity in its spirituality. So out of the 13 or so precepts I mentioned, some of these are kind of open to every Muslim, more or less, if you're a little bit attentive in your practice. But some of them are would really come with a lot of spiritual practice. And yeah, as in this work, he doesn't go deeply into it. Like, for example, this kashf haqaiq al-ashya hota hai ya chashme basirat khulti hai. These are I'm sure he develops these. I can't in other works at length.
Well,